Okay, all. This is Dean again. So welcome to the webinar today. I'm just going to hand over to Melanie first of all.
Okay, Dean, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
Great, and I'm sure everyone else can as well. Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Sturck, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by the Mining Industry Human Resources Council, or MIR. MIR contributes to the strength, competitiveness, and sustainability of the Canadian mining industry by leading the collaboration among communities of interest to address emerging human resources opportunities and challenges. As the Director of Attraction, Retention, and Transition here at MIR, my main areas of focus are on diversity and career awareness. So over the last 16 months, I've been working with the consulting team, Greybridge Malcolm, and what we've dubbed a diversity network of 9 employers in mining on a project called SHIFT, Take Action for Diversity. With the support of MIR and Greybridge Malcolm, each member of the network developed goals and implemented actions that seek to improve the engagement of currently underrepresented demographic groups in mining, including women. The project concludes in February, and a report will be widely disseminated for others to learn from. So today's webinar is an initiative of this project, but we've made it available to people outside of the network so that they too have the opportunity to benefit from today's conversation with Dean. This webinar will be recorded, and it will be available on MIR and Factive's websites, and the URLs for these websites will be displayed at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce to you Dr. Dean LaPlanche, today's speaker. Dean is a leading researcher and consultant in the field of gender, safety, and communications. His current areas of professional interest include gender behaviors in the mining and oil and gas industries, safety communications, and also equity in the workplace. He is the lead researcher on Factive's Mining for a Safer Masculinity project and has extensive experience addressing gender and communication issues in the resources sector for organizations such as BHP Billiton, Iron Ore, Inpex, Rio Tinto, Fortescue Minerals, Worsley Alumina, Nickel West, Horizon Power, and the Department of Mines and Petroleum in Western Australia. Dean is an adjunct senior lecturer at the University of New South Wales and is currently completing his second master's, this time in the field of peace and conflict studies from the University of Peace. When not flying out to carry out work on mine sites, Dean lives in Doketown in the center of New Brunswick. So I'm very pleased to have Dean with us today. I've been looking forward to host the webinar where Dean speaks for quite some time. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it straight over to you, Dean. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Melanie. And I've just before we start, I've just noticed that Courtney has arrived as well. Well, she may still be signing in. You may hear as we're going through the webinar a few beeps, which just indicates that people are arriving. Just in terms of the structure of the webinar today, what I'm going to do is I will be muting everybody in a sense, which it means you can still listen and you still should be able to see the screen. It just enables me then to present the materials. If at any point as I'm presenting you have a comment or a question, please do write that in the chat box, which should be visible on your screen, and I will respond to that as soon as I can throughout the presentation. We will also have then some time where I'll unmute everybody towards the end of the presentation for general discussion and questions. So before I do mute everybody, which sounds like an impolite thing to do, but before I do that, does anybody have any immediate questions or any concerns about the audio or the visual at this point? No, in that case then I'm just going to mute everybody. Okay, so like I say, if you have any questions or comments about what I'm saying as we go along, please do put these in the chat box. What I want to do today is I want to talk about some of the specifics of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, which is built on extensive research. What I do is come from a broader concept of gender diversity, and I've been working in that field for about 20 years now, or I'm researching in that field, and then I apply that to the current debate about gender in the mining industry. And the basic argument that I have is that it is my opinion, and this is based on practices of gender diversity or approaches to gender diversity in other industries. It is my opinion that the current debate about gender in the mining industry is based on an incorrect model of gender, which is no longer relevant to our lives. And so the aim of this presentation is to talk you through that, talk through why I feel that way and why the research has shown that, and what is the different kind of model towards gender that we apply in the work that we do. So the first thing that I want to do is have a little bit of an introduction about gender more broadly. I have been working in the mining industry and the oil and gas industries for about 6 or 7 years now, but I come from a much broader sort of theoretical and practical application of gender which is outside of these industries. So I'm very much interested in gender as a broad topic. And I believe that gender is not isolated from the broader practices and understanding of gender. So it's therefore important that when we look at gender in the mining industry, we don't assume that it's an isolated example of gender. Broader debates and broader understandings, broader theories, broader practices of gender outside of the mining industry are relevant to the way that we understand gender in the mining industry. Okay, I am aware that some people have said that there may have been a little bit of feedback. Hopefully that is okay now. It may help if you also put your own phones on mute so that others are not hearing any feedback your end as well. Okay, my primary concern then in saying this when I look at the broader issues of gender is that I was actually at a conference, at a women's conference about a couple of months ago out in Sydney, Australia. And one of the keynote speakers at the time, she was not talking about gender in the mining industry, she was talking about gender in a different context. But she said one of her concerns was that she felt that a whole range of research and practice of gender that had emerged over the last 30, 40 years was not being applied in the workspace and also in the community space. And as I was sitting there listening to her, I thought that's exactly how I feel. I'd never articulated it that way, but when I'm working on site with either people who are responsible for gender diversity or senior managers or people in the field in operations, what I'm constantly surprised at is the omission of the wealth of research and thinking about gender that has emerged over the past 3 or 4 decades. And there's such a diversity of thinking around gender, and not all of it that I agree with, and sometimes I write against that or argue against particular theories of gender in my work. But even the theories that I disagree with seem to be missing from the debate, and so I take that as a bit of a concern. And when I approach gender and talk about gender more broadly, this is often one of the first things that I do with senior managers in the initial workshops, is to say, well, what I want to move towards is a complication of gender. Gender is not simple, and I think that the way that it is being approached in the mining industry does often assume that it is something very, very simple, very simplistic, a very simple idea of man versus woman. And this is not the way that I go about my work. I do look at very small and micro practices of gender on a particular mine site. Of course, the application of my ideas and my work is the most important in terms of outcome for clients and for the employees. But I do this within a framework of gender as a much broader issue. So I show you this first slide. You see here a couple of boys playing soccer and one boy lying on the ground. So this is one of 2 slides that I want to show you just to give a bit of an introduction of gender more broadly and where I come from. The reason why I use these slides is in a sense reading these slides is to say, well, what else can we say about gender in addition to what we already know or assume? And the first thing we notice about this slide here is I'm talking about gender for boys. Gender is not just about women. And this is incredibly important, I feel, in particularly in male-dominated industries. When we have a debate, and that debate is called a gender debate or gender diversity, and essentially what we're doing is looking at women, we are saying the solution is women and therefore the problem is women. And we have to and so what's missing there is consideration of gender as it relates to men. I would argue that in this picture, though, there's possibly some people would say, well, there's an acceptance that gender, and particularly gender amongst men, is learned. There's no longer a strong belief that it's innate, that it's born into us, that it's genetic, that it's biological. There's been a separation of sex and gender, and that separation occurred a number of decades ago, particularly in the second wave of the women's movement in the 1960s, to say, well, look, there are fundamentally men and women, but the way they behave is social, that it's learned. And so here we have an example of boys learning a particular sport, which may be considered more relevant to boys than others, to girls, though that is changing. And we've got a practice of domination going on here. So who is the strongest in the game? Who gets to control the game? And we have an example of one of the boys that appears to be lying on the ground with an injury. And I think this picture, more so than the next one that I'm going to show you, does represent the idea of gender that exists and is dominant in the mining industry today. We see it as a bit of fun, something to play around with if we have the time and the money. And it's unfortunate, I think, particularly in Australia right now, there has been a bit of a downturn in the mining revenues. Not significant, but there's talk about a bit of a slowdown in production in mining. And this has resulted in a withdrawal of attention to gender issues. So if we've got the money, we might look at it. And if we do look at it, well, it's something of a side issue. It's not something that's right across the business. It's something around numbers of employment. We're sort of playing around with it. And what I want to argue, or what I'd rather suggest, is that gender is actually something a lot more serious than this. And so I show you this picture here with the title there, Toughen Up Princess. Toughen Up Princess is a term that is used very much in the Australian vernacular to indicate to a boy or a man that they are not behaving as a man should, that they're actually behaving like a girl and therefore need to toughen up. So here we have a similar kind of approach in that gender can be seen to be about men. We've got 3 boys here. We've also got a mixture of pain and pleasure that boys experience out of participating in masculinity or learning what it means to be a man. The pleasure for the guys that can adequately show that they are real men, participate in what we might consider to be real masculinity, and the pain for those that don't. And this is a particularly violent one as well. If we're talking about gender, issues of violence are incredibly important. The relationship between masculinity and violence is incredibly important. On a broader scale that has been discussed in terms of violence against women, domestic violence. We also see evidence of this within the mining industry. Sometimes it's physical violence, very much the effect of gender practices on people's well-being is incredibly, incredibly strong. We see it in the language. I've got there, Toughen Up Princess. There's a lot of terms that are used, particularly by men, to help encourage men to be real men, proper men. The term girl is an insult that can be targeted at men to indicate, to put them outside of masculinity. One of the worst things that a boy can be in school is a girl, and this continues into the workplace. There's also the question of whether, as a culture, and this is the wider culture, but also let's look at the mining industry culture, do we have a preference for masculinity over femininity? Do we emphasize that what is good gender are things like competitiveness and aggression and getting the job done and being able to make quick decisions and having lots of knowledge? Do we emphasize those kinds of things in the wider culture and also in the mining industry? And if so, what are the effects on women of that? Women who participate in either that macro broader culture or the specific mining culture. And the final thing, I think, why I choose this particular image is because there are racial elements to gender as well. We often, it's easy for us to look, particularly from an Anglo culture, to maybe look at an image like this and say, oh yes, that kind of representation or practice of masculinity is elsewhere. It's other. It's in a foreign country. This is not the case. We have very damaging practices of masculinity that go on in our own cultures, in our own homes and on our own work sites. So the reason, I mean, this broader discussion that I'm talking about here, there are two things that I'm saying. Firstly, let's welcome the complexity of gender. Let's not try to simplify it. I think we need to welcome the complexity of it, and then we can work with that complexity. And the second thing is, let's take it really seriously. We are not playing around with something here. We are not playing around with something that doesn't have very real impacts on safety, personal health and well-being, wider workplace culture, workplace morale, production, and so on. Gender is not a sideline issue, and when a company treats it like a sideline issue, I argue that they are not taking it seriously, and I work very hard to convince my clients that it needs to be taken seriously. My main push, and I'm aware at the moment that I'm in the middle of finishing up a book on my experiences in dealing with gender in the mining industry, and one of the first things that I do in the first main chapter is to say at the beginning, a new vision of gender is needed in the resources industry. That's my responsibility, I believe, as based on my experiences and the background that I have in gender studies and women's studies and masculinity studies, and the specific workplace experience that I have in the mining industry and increasingly in the oil and gas industry, is to explain what this new vision is, why it's needed, and how it's going to work. So I'm going to explain it today, and I'm going to talk in theory about the kind of things that or broadly I should say, the kind of things that we do on site. In terms of specifics for your organizations, that's going to be obviously beyond this webinar, whether we have then further conversations or whether we discuss at the end what does this mean in practice on site. But I do take it as my responsibility to be able to explain what is this new vision you're talking about, Dean? Where does it come from? Give me the evidence that you're not just making it up, and often I am accused, particularly by men, you're making it up, you're making it more complicated than it needs to be, and my argument is, or my response is, yes, I am complicating it because I truly believe that this new vision can work. So I have been researching, studying in the field of gender studies for about 20 years. I did my PhD looking specifically at issues of masculinity and the way that the Australian men in particular, what tools and stories do they have to enable them to explain their relationships with other men and the limitations of those. And as I say, in the last 6 years, and Melanie has explained some of the clients that I've been working for in this field. I think there's been, over the last couple of years, there's a growing interest in this kind of work, and certainly this year I know we are about to start 2 quite significant research and implementation projects with large mining companies. So that's the vision that I have. Let's have a look at a brief history of gender. Let's see what is this new vision. So the brief history of gender, and this is going to be I'm sort of talking about hundreds of years of the discussion and practice of gender, really put into a 3-minute spiel here. Brief history of gender says that men and women, first of all, women and women come with natural masculinity. So that on the one hand, there's women who are feminine, on the other hand, there are men who are masculine, and they are easily separated. And then along comes this sort of entity or this thing called feminism, and feminism starts to question the naturalness of masculinity and femininity, particularly femininity. Because what feminism wants to do, and if we look at the history of the women's movement, the first wave of the women's movement says, back at the turn of the 20th century, says, well, women want the vote and women want the right to own property. And then as we move into the 1960s, 1970s, women also want rights to control their body. Women also want rights to participate in the workforce alongside men. So the women's movement or feminism says, let's separate sex from gender. We still conflate those words. We still often use them to mean the same thing. But feminism said we want to have them separated. We want to say, okay, let's accept that there are naturally men and naturally women, but let's not accept that there are natural gender roles for those men and women. We can change them. And in fact, feminism whatever we think of the word and whatever we think of that sort of ideology as a whole, feminism and the women's movement have been incredibly successful in our societies, not just in changing options for women, but also in changing options for men. One of the things that emerges out of this is that gender becomes gender itself, not sex. We've still got fixed natural biological sex, but gender becomes multiple and diverse. And here I have some images of different kinds of ways that men could act. And these are all representations, but also can be represented in real life. So you can have the tough loner, the person who is in control, isolated, who can destroy anything that gets in his way, the aggressive kind of man. You can also have, more recently, the metrosexual kind of man, the man who puts his body on display, is not afraid of being the object of desire, and is very much interested in the body, his own body. You can have the man who is the controller, who is the swearer, who is aggressive, but not in a violent way, perhaps more in a sort of a mental way, where they continue to control. And you can have men who blur the boundaries, this gender-bending kind of approach to masculinity that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, where you start to get more of an androgynous kind of masculinity. So you've got all these different, and this is just four of many that we could find, different ways that men could be men. And exactly the same for women. So you have the idea that the woman can be all about body, all about beauty and a particular kind of beauty, all about being desired for her body. You can have the woman who is the action hero. A lot has been written on this, the Sigourney Weaver kind of approach in Aliens, where she almost takes on an equivalent role to the Rambo, that sort of aggressive and physically active kind of woman. You can have the corporate woman. This is the woman who is very contained and very capable and able to do the same job that men do in the corporate world. And you can also have the woman or the girl that starts to blur the boundaries between what it means to be a man and a boy. And here we have a representation from the movie Boys Don't Cry, where you have a girl passing as a boy quite successfully for a while. So gender, within that debate, and over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of research, a lot of looking at the diversity of the way that we do gender. There's no longer there's no longer just one way. Now, it doesn't mean that people might not have their views still on what is the best way or the right way, but there's a multitude of ways of doing gender. And within that debate, gender has come to be seen as far more important than sex. So whether you're a man or a woman is no longer an issue, but how you do your gender has become the important focus. Sex too, and I sort of talk about this a little bit in my book, sex too has started to be multiplied and diversified. I don't focus too much on that for my work in the mining industry because I think it sort of goes off the topic a bit, but we can now start to talk about intersex and transgender and sex changes and all that kind of stuff. So sex too has started to be pulled apart in the debate, but I think where we are, or where the potential is in the mining industry, is really to focus on that idea of diversity of gender, diversity of ways of behaving as men and women. But I don't see at this point much evidence to suggest that the debate about gender in mining is really interested in multiple ways of being men or being women. It's somewhat interested in the changing roles of women because it wants women to have access to the roles that men have occupied for a long time. It wants women to be able to enter into mine sites and work in operation spaces, driving trucks and working the machinery. It wants women to be able to have access to senior management positions. So it's somewhat interested in the changing roles of women, but it does so in a way that continues to separate men from women, and that is the focus. It says we're interested in this slight change of roles for women and women only, but we're not really talking about multiple ways of doing gender. We're still talking about numbers. We're still talking about women as an imagined group of the same people being able to enter into this formerly male space. To support these claims that I make about mining, I just want to have a look at some of the key points that have emerged about the debate in gender over the last 30, 40 years, and see which of these are actually really being taken into consideration and thought through in the debate about gender in mining. So when we look at gender as personal, that's one of the key things that has come out of the debate, that gender is something very personal. It argues that gender and sex are not the same thing. So you're either a man or a woman, you're naturally biologically a man or a woman, but then you have a particular behaviors, particular characteristics that indicate your gender. Gender is not natural, it argues. Gender is something that is actually constructed. Gender is not stable, it is changing. As we're going through these, think about where are these are the key points that have come out of the gender debate over the last 30, 40 years, but are they there in the debate about gender in mining? When we think about gender diversity and we say one of the key points is that gender and sex are not the same, but how do we measure whether we have gender diversity on site? What are we looking at? Often what I find in my work is that the people are looking for numbers, statistics. So there what we're actually talking about is sex. We're not talking about gender diversity. We're talking about numbers of women and numbers of men. That's an issue of sex. When we say that gender is not natural, a key point from the debate, but it's often assumed in the debate about gender in the mining industry that gender is very natural. You're a man and you're a woman. I hear often, particularly from middle-level managers when I'm talking about behaviors, particularly amongst men in crews, that will say, yes, but there's nothing we can do about it. They're just men being men. They're boys being boys. I heard that response once when we were investigating a serious injury within a crew. And the result or the cause of the injury was actually because the men were joking with each other. They were joking around and playing tricks on each other, and it escalated and somebody got injury. And the response of their supervisor at the time of the investigation, so this was after the injury, was yeah, but there's not really much you can do about that. That's just what men do. They play tricks on each other. Gender is not owned is another key point that comes out of the debate. I don't have gender. I can't say that I am masculine or am feminine. I'm always constantly striving to get it. So it's practiced. Do we recognize in the debate about gender in mining that we are constantly practicing gender? Do we recognize where are the representations within this mine site or within this company that I look to learn how to be a good man or a good woman? Or do we just assume that men and women naturally have their gender? Another key point is that gender is attributed or gained, and that it's never complete. You are always making a judgment on whether I'm being a good man or a good woman, and vice versa. It's never complete. I am never in a position where I can say, I have it now. I constantly have to keep using certain language to show that I'm a man or a woman. I constantly have to dress a certain way to show that I'm a man or a woman. And there are often ideals within the wider culture, but also a workplace that say, yes, you've got it right now. You're never going to totally have it, but you've got it and you're doing good. And there'll be other ways of showing that you're not doing so good. There's also the issue that gender is cultural, and this is probably where the gender as personal is a lot of the work that I do in smaller groups or one-on-one, and we find that out through interviews and focus groups. But the issue of gender as cultural, again, this is a key point that have come out of the debate over the last 30, 40 years about gender. It says that gender is in all institutions, so the argument that our education system is gendered, our legal system is gendered, our political system is gendered, our family system or family institutions are gendered. Where is the debate about the idea that the mining industry is gendered? Where is the debate that looks at specific mining companies and says, how is this company gendered? How are your policies and procedures gendered? How is your hierarchy gendered? How is the very practice, the very production of the mineral that you're interested in, how is that also gendered? And if we pull that apart, what do we find? Gender, it says that gender is never neutral. The argument in the debate is that gender is always linked to power. How is gender linked to power in the mining industry? who now currently benefits from the way that gender is practiced and understood. And I'm not saying this is all men, because we see examples of women also benefiting from the practice of gender as it is right now. But who has the power because of the way that gender is explained and understood right now? Gender is relational, and this is a really important one. But the idea in the wider debate is that gender is it's not I don't have it. It's about how I relate to those institutions and to other people. So in what way are people learning and practicing and reproducing gender because of the relations that they have with other people on their crew, with their supervisors and management, and with the company itself? Gender is not being brought into the mind site within individual bodies. It is being produced on that mind site in multiple ways. And it's contextual. So not every mind site is going to be the same. When you look at gender across history, gender practices of what it means to be a man and a woman have changed so drastically over the last 100 years. Myself, with my work, because I now live in Canada and I fly back to Australia quite a lot, I can see very, very different practices of gender in the culture between particularly masculinity as it's practiced in Australia and masculinity as it gets practiced in Canada. So it's contextual. It's very likely that your workspaces will be producing gender in a particular way that people won't be carrying home necessarily. They will be doing gender very differently at home, or when they're hanging out with their friends, or when people go into different positions in the hierarchy of the organization. So all of these are key points within the debate about gender in the wider in the wider debate that's emerged over the last 30, 40 years. But I think they're seriously lacking in the debate about gender in mining, because this is what I see. When I go into workspaces, this is inevitably what the debate is about, what we're talking about. How many women do we have working in the field? How many women do we have working in senior management positions, and what are the things that we can do to increase the numbers of both of those? That's an issue of sex. That's an issue of equity. And if we're looking at it from an equity point of view alone, then maybe that would suffice. But I don't believe that is the only way that we should look at gender. What we're actually also doing in that, and I mentioned this at the start, is we're saying we have a problem with gender, and our solution to the gender problem is women, more women. So what we're effectively saying is the problem is women, and that's where our focus starts. And one of the first things that we tend to do when we go into organizations is spend a couple of days with senior managers to get them to shift that focus. The focus is not women. The problem is not women. The problem is the way that the organization encourages and practices gender. So we need to revisit those points about gender that have come out of the debate and really start to think about, well, if we take these as important to the wider debate about gender, why are we not taking them as important in the debate about gender in the mining industry, and how can we? I'm starting to get very critical now, and I anticipate and hope that at the end of this webinar that there will be some questions and comments, and people will have different views. This is the position that I'm starting to take increasingly as I start to work with clients, because it is about a bit of a shake-up and saying, come on, we've really got to deal with this seriously. Because what I see, and this is from the research that we've done and the work that we've done over the last 6 or 7 years, is that we're in a stage of repetition and stagnation, and in some senses failure, and that's not something we like to admit. But the failure is there, I believe, not because it's an automatic failure, but because of the focus that we've had on gender to date. We've had, I think the first report that we can identify, I think it was written about 1995, which is similar to the reports that are coming out now, but almost 20 years of reporting into women in mining. Lots of organizations and industry bodies doing research and reports on women in mining. What we see, we've analyzed those reports, is that they're pretty much the same. even though you've got different geographical locations and different historical periods, and you're talking often or interviewing different women, speaking to different women, the approaches of those reports, so the methodologies that are being used, and the results are pretty much the same. So 20 years of that. One of the questions I ask when people talk to me about their interest in doing another research report into women in mining, I ask why. Why not just look at the reports that have already been done? Because as far as we can see, we're seeing a repetition of approaches and responses. We're actually also seeing very small changes in numbers of women. It may go up and down. There are some organizations that I know, some of our clients have experienced a spike, but overall, we're seeing very small changes in numbers of women throughout the mining industry as a whole. And this is not unusual in a masculine or a masculinized, male-dominant industry, but we're seeing very small changes in women. What I hear as well a lot is senior managers saying they've tried the best that they can. They've tried everything they can, and it's not working. Now, there's a number of issues or questions that I often ask them there. I say, well, okay, first of all, tell me what it is that you've tried, and they'll talk about their reports and often trying to target women and go out and speak to women, encourage them to come to the mine site and so on. One of the things I say is what you haven't tried is to shift the focus of the problem, and that's the first thing that we need to do. You haven't tried everything, and one of the things that I have learned, and it's possibly some people would argue why I'm also attracted to the mining industry, is there are a lot of egos in the mining industry, and I'm very guilty of having a big one too at times. And it's very hard for those of us that work in a male-dominated industry to say, I just don't know what I'm talking about here. I don't have sufficient knowledge. And when it comes to gender, I don't believe that I have sufficient knowledge. It is so complex. We are constantly learning about it. One of the things we do need to recognize, particularly at a senior management level, is the knowledge isn't there. We need to try and expand that knowledge, shift the focus, and then we can try things completely differently. There's also been little impact on men. I don't understand how you can have a debate about mining in an industry where more than 80% of the workforce is men and have no significant focus on men and masculinity as part of the debate. There have been very little impacts on men, yet I do hear a lot of men in the field saying, these women are coming to take our jobs. My son is no longer going to be able to get the job that he's supposed to have because it's going to be given to a woman and so on. So there's a little bit of fear going on. But in terms of real impacts and real demand for men to explore issues of gender, that's not there. There has been the development of a fear of femininity in the industry. I have met very recently a mine manager in Western Australia who has started, and I find this very amusing, but we've spoken a number of times with her why she's doing this. But after the end of her shift lasts 12 days, it's a fly in, fly out roster, before she goes to board the plane, she goes back to her little hut and she gets dressed in her feminine clothes. She puts on her high heels and she wears her dress, and she's the mine manager. And she said initially, she's been doing this for a while now, so people are used to it, but initially the stares and the comments were, she said, were astounding. All she was doing was putting on a dress and some high heels to go home, but this was so out of place in the industry. And there was a recent report as well written coming out of the Curtin University in Western Australia, which spoke about, it had done some interviews with senior managers, senior female managers in the mining industry, talking about how they downplay any comment about femaleness or feminism or femininity when they talk about their own successes. And I experienced that very much at a conference in Montreal, was it last year or the year before, where women were giving talks about, how did you become successful in the mining industry, and not one of them mentioned anything actually about being a woman or being feminine or anything to do with wider developments in the women's movement that had enabled them to be there. It was all about individual sense of achievement and challenge and overcoming, very much promoting a masculinity. There have also been no investigations into the gendered business of mining, and this too is really important. Your policies, your procedures, your histories, your workplace practices, your organisational hierarchies, the actual physical design of mine sites. We've had no discussion around what is the place that gender plays there. The entire business of mining, we've assumed that it is genderless and that we can get some more women involved and we will bring them on board and bring them into the industry, and that they will automatically change the culture for us, or that they will automatically fit in. And what I see, one of the projects that we're working on this year is actually a mine site that has tried this for the last 20 years, and they've said it's just failing. We find that women come and they rapidly go, and the response that senior management have had is to say, see, it just goes to show that mining is a man's world. And so they justify not really unpacking how gender works in the workplace by seeing those women up and go. So we're not really having a discussion, I don't feel, about how to change the gender culture of an industry. What we're having is a discussion about sexual equality, the split of the sexes in the workplace. We're also having a debate that reaffirms there is an absolute distinction between men and women. And this is not the case. When I interview and speak to men and women on mine site, there is such a diversity of genders, of the way that they understand and practice gender, but they are being pigeonholed into practice masculinity one way as men and practice femininity, which is often leaning more towards the masculine side, as women. We have a debate that is an attempt, I believe, and this is where the power issue comes in, to justify that belief is naturally a male industry. And mining is not alone here. We've seen similar results in other male-dominated industries like the police, the defence force, forestry, manufacturing, oil and gas, and so on. Time and time again, this approach that says men and women are fundamentally different, we want gender equality, and we will achieve this by getting some more women in, and we will do all we can to get those women involved. It is the wrong approach to gender, and it does not solve the issue. So what do we look for? And this is where I get into the diversity of things that we do, and often the complexity of things, and think about how many of these might apply in your own workspace. What do we look for? There are three. I've split this into three columns. The first thing is we want to diversify. We want to do that complication of gender. We want to really pull it apart and allow it to be multiple and diverse. So the first thing is to understand the diversity in the workforce. This often involves research with people about how they actually understand and practice gender on site. Not something to do with a policy, not something to do with statistics of men versus women. How are the people really practicing and understanding gender? I find when we do those interviews, we come out with some fascinating examples. I have had men admit to me the pain that they are going through trying to live within the culture, that it is out of touch with the way that they want to practice gender or how they practice gender at home. I have had women say to me that they spend all their off time sitting in their little huts. They don't socialize with other people because they've become afraid. I've had people who have very, very different notions of what it means to be a man or a woman, but they feel they're being stifled and that they're having to perform man and woman in a particular way. If we can really understand that diversity, we have a lot to work with. The second thing, as I've mentioned, is shift the problem away from women. I'm absolutely adamant with that, and when I went to another conference a couple of months ago, just south of Sydney in Australia, and this was a masculinities conference. A lot of people talking there about their work in a number of industries, looking at issues relating to men. And they consistently, one of the things that we were finding is that when you go into those workplaces, the issue initially is always about women. It is not about women. This is about a lack of access to tools and resources that allow diversity to flourish. And that goes on to the third thing there. Promote ways to make diversity visible and manageable. What are the tools and resources that people need to negotiate their genders every day? The mass diversity of genders. We can't do this with a policy. We can't do this by having some 2-hour training camp. We can't do this by creating a brochure that appeals to a particular kind of woman. These are people on the ground who every day are negotiating their genders. How are they able to do that? What are the tools that they have? What are the resources? Where do they have the space to be able to discuss gender as an ongoing issue? When they have that space, they can start to talk about gender as multiple and not as woman. People can start to understand that gender is not a simple thing of being a man or being a woman. It is actually very complex, and that helps with that diversification. The second column there is involve. Who needs to get involved? I've already mentioned men. Absolutely, without question, your men at every level in the organization need to be involved in a discussion about gender, and not a discussion about women as a gendered category, but a discussion about their own behaviors, their own practices, and what it means to be a man in the mining industry, in their team, and so on. Again, some fascinating things that you can find. The example that we had of the injury that I spoke about earlier, where we interviewed crew members and talk about the injury that occurred because they were sort of playing around and playing tricks on each other. What emerged as a result of that discussion is that the majority of men in that group knew or felt that it had gone too far, but they didn't know how to stop it because they just thought they would be seen as the one that was sort of backing down, or the princess, as it were. They just didn't have the tools or the resources. Nobody had said to them, let's sit down and discuss what's going on. The second thing to involve is safety. There is a recognized clear link between gender and safety, yet I've failed to meet one single safety professional working in the oil and gas industry or in the mining industry who talks to me about how they negotiate gender every day in their safety work, how they understand the link between gender and safety, and how gender impacts on the kind of risks that we are willing to take and the kind of risks that we should take if we want to be seen as real men or real women. We need to involve business planning, and this goes back, it's not just business planning, but the application of all kinds of business initiatives as well. Right at that level of business planning, policy, how are we going to design a growth strategy, or we've got a new expansion going on. Where's gender in that? Because gender is an important part of that planning. We also need to involve engineers, and I talk about engineers here. We could include geologists as well, and any other kind of traditional, typical people that we would expect to find in an industry like mining. It is very unlikely that they will ever have been asked to have had a discussion or to start learning more about gender. If you look at all the we're actually in negotiation with the university, with Queen's University at the moment in Ontario, looking at the possibility of engaging their students in discussions about the cultural aspects of mining, gender being one of them. But most engineers, or most people working in the mining industry, if they've come through a traditional university education, or they've come through the trade background, it is highly unlikely they will ever have had any opportunity to discuss gender. So we need to engage them. We need to start finding out what they think and what they feel, and then giving them some education. One of the last things we don't do is hide gender away in a corner of human resources. It's not a soft human issue, and I say that in scare quotes. It is a real important issue that affects every aspect of the business. If it's put aside into human resources, it's something that they do over there, something that they deal with, something that is just about statistics and recruitment. And then what we ignore are the everyday practices of gender that go on amongst the workforce. And the last thing is organize. This is around, sorry, I've just pressed that wrong. This is about organizing the organization as a whole. Investigate the history. This is the wider history of the mining industry. So people say history is a man's world. That's actually false. There's lots of evidence that shows that women and children historically have been involved in the mining industry. So let's speak those stories. But also look at the history of your own workplace or your own company. Where has there been evidence of gender diversity already? Where is it? We're not starting from scratch. Inevitably, when I go into an organization, I can pretty much guarantee we will find gender diversity already there. We will find multiple ways of being men and being women. Let's investigate that. Audit your company to make gender visible. There is a There are some well-recognized gender audit tools. Usually these are used to focus on that women and numbers of women, but you can use gender audit tools as well to really ask questions like how well is my company seen as a gender diverse company? How well respected is it? When we have engagement with external stakeholders, do they recognize our company as being gender diverse? Going back to business planning or infrastructure, what in our business planning and in our policy making, in our budget setting, how visible is gender there? Where do we have debates around gender? It has become quite commonplace for us to have everyday debates around safety. Are we having everyday debates around gender? Where can they fit in? And the final thing is to live a gendered business. Your business, I can pretty much guarantee your organization, your workplace culture is not genderless. It is very gendered. So make it visible. Make your workplace culture a visible gendered culture. Make your leadership systems visibly gendered. Make your policies visibly gendered, because it is then that you will start to see what some of the issues are and what you can deal with. So my final point, and again this is a quote from my book, as much as it is in its before it gets torn apart by the editor, I'm sure. I say a stagnation of new ideas and a reputation of inefficient practices in mining are the results of a myopic view of the kind of person who's a good fit for the industry. We can overcome all this by expanding our understanding of gender and by accepting more diversity in the way we practice gender at work. And this is why I argue, and through the book I start to, and through my work I show this, that gender diversity is not just about men and women, the sexes of people. There are enormous benefits to the mining industry in taking this seriously. The first thing is the introduction of new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving, which brings with it innovation. That then has flow-on effects for production. If we can look at the production of mining through as a gendered practice, this could radically change the way that we view and do mining. Gender diversity has enormous impacts on the health and safety of your workforce and wider workplace morale. I have seen some horrendous outcomes of people who have been affected by gendered behaviors and the gender culture of their organization, ranging from depression in men to sexual harassment in women to physical abuse as well. Those are some of the outcomes if we don't take gender seriously, that it can have an enormous effect on health and safety. We've also done a number of investigations into safety incidents that have been linked to gendered behaviors. So the question, resource companies and industry bodies will support, and often there's a lot of support and funding for the development of new technologies which contribute to improvement in things like innovation and production and health and safety and so on. But gender really, I don't believe, is being considered a priority for the whole of the business. And yet all the evidence is there. All the evidence is there that suggests that if you really take gender seriously and look at gender not as a man versus woman issue, but as multiple and complex, and start to integrate that into the way that you do business, it has very real benefits for your entire business. So I thank you for your time. I am going to unmute everybody now. Obviously, if you have a question to ask, if I can just ask you to maybe type in the chat box, and I'll ask each person at a time to put their question forward, or to make a comment, and we can have a general discussion. I can hear people typing away, which is great. Melanie, would you like to say anything at the end of the presentation while we're waiting for some questions to come in? Or does anybody want to make a comment while we're waiting?
Hi, Hi, Dean. Sorry, I guess I was muted still.
That's okay. I should have unmuted everybody now. It may be if you're not able to talk, the mute will be on your own phone. So I can see, for example, Carolyn and a couple of others are muted. It may be because you haven't entered the PIN. But just if you type your question in, I can answer it on your behalf. So.
I was just saying thank you so much for your presentation. Really find it fascinating to think about mining culture from this perspective and looking at the gendered culture of the sector and how that can have an impact on both men and women and the ability to diversify and really create inclusive types of workplaces that are healthy. Looking forward to hearing what the rest of the group has to say, but I do have a question for you that's very practical.
Sure.
You mentioned that companies should consider making examples or making policies that are gendered, that are quite obviously gendered. Can you give some examples of gendered policies?
Okay, so it's not specific policies. One of the things that we do in a gendered audit, for example, particularly when you're looking at diversity of gender, you can include an audit, like a desktop review of key documents. We tend to include, there will be key documents specifically from about gender diversity or at a HR level, but also key safety documents and key documents that talk about the mission statement of the organization. And also internal communication, so it might be around magazines that are used or key methods of communicating business ideas or business messages. And what we look for is, first of all, the language. There's been a lot of work that talks about gender as being, language being gendered and the way that we use language, but also the impact on people. So when you're looking at and you can start with that sort of very simple model that I say we shouldn't do. When you say, okay, I've got this policy, you have a discussion, how might a man respond to this, and how might a woman respond to it, and what are the differences? And then through that kind of discussion and thinking, you hopefully get into a little bit more complexity of, well, if I was this kind of man, I would respond this way. If I was that kind of woman, I would respond that way. And that's particularly one of the things we have found is particularly important with safety communications, that men, the kind of language and ideas that are promoted in safety communications can be read very differently by particular kinds of men in a way that has negative impacts on their safety. So, a particular safety initiative that might be considered to be great and it's all the researchers there showing its safety, then the way that we communicate it, so the policy about it or the standard about it or some internal communications about it, the language that we use and the tone that we use can have an effect on the way that particular kinds of men respond to it. I've got a question here from Denise. Denise has said, what is the benefit of treating culture and behavioral issues such as safety risk, taking decision-making process, etc., as gender-related? Denise, I mean, you may want to respond as well. I'm not sure whether the answer or a question thrown back would be, what is the benefit of not doing this? I see at the moment, particularly with the clients that I work with, that we're not treating culture, behavioural issues, safety, risk, etc. as gendered, and we're missing a huge opportunity. I mean, the research alone, and this is outside the field of mining or resourcing, but the research alone that talks about how gender and how our expectations of gender affect our risk-taking behaviours is immense. There's a lot of work that talks about the effects this has on us, on the brain, or psychologically, or culturally, in sort of gambling and driving and all these behaviours that involve risk. All that wealth of information is there. I don't understand why an industry like mining that takes safety so seriously has not said, here's another element. It's not the only way to solve safety, but here's another really important element that we need to consider, because hey, more than 80% of our workforce are men, and consistently this research is saying that if you're born a man in this world, what it means to be a man involves taking a lot of risk and continuation of a lot of risk. And we see that in the health statistics as well in terms of men's illness and so on. So I think there's the benefit of treating gender as important to risk-taking and safety is better safety outcomes, saving people's lives, reducing injuries, absolutely. If at any point, by the way, when I'm responding to a question and it's your question, please feel free to throw something back. I've got a comment from Courtney who says, I completed my master's in the UBC Mining Engineering Department, focusing on the impacts on workplace culture on women's career in the mining industry. I found in the study that access to informal networks is a significant benefit to career advancement for women, i.e. I was not invited to activities where significant work relationships are developed. How do you see access to informal networks in mining connected to this gender discussion? Courtney, that's a great one, and I often get into trouble here because I am not a member of any of the formal networks for the women in mining and so on, and it's a constant struggle that I have with myself. Should I join? I'm really interested in the work that they do, but how independent can I remain, and how, in a sense, critical of the work, critically constructive, I hope, of the work can I be if I'm within those groups? A lady that I met at the conference, the women's conference, a couple of months ago, said to me that one of the reasons why she is not fond of these, not so much these networks, but putting up successful women in an industry as role models, is she said they've actually got enough work to do already. They don't need to have the added task of being a role model for all of women. And I actually did get contacted by a lady who works in the mining industry the other week, and I'm going to work with her to help her develop her story. But she came back to me and said, I find that I'm being asked to be this role model and even to help men to understand more about gender. And she said, why is it that I'm being asked to do this? I want to get on with my career too. When was the last time we asked a man to take on the role model for women? Why can't they do it? If they're already there in those positions, why shouldn't they be doing it? So I think there's a double-edged sword to those informal and formal networks in terms of gender, women's networks and so on, doing very good work to give women access to information and education to be able to share their stories. But at the same time, my question is, are they also feeding into that notion of gender as being about men and women that I believe is actually also responsible for many of the problems? So I've answered the question. If anybody else has typed any questions at the moment that I've missed, please do let me know. Or does anybody have anything that they'd like to say? Courtney, that's what... Sorry, yes? Yep.
Yeah, I know from speaking with industry, there's been a lot of talk around related to female heavy equipment operators.
Yep.
And a lot of talk around how women drivers tend to be safer, easier on the equipment, and so on. I'm wondering if any of the other representatives of companies on the webinar have anything to say around gender. And again, I was talking about women, so be careful there, but around safety and gender in their workplaces that they've actually seen, and encourage people to just vocalize. They don't need to tape out their response.
Yep. Does anybody have anything to say on that? I mean, while people might be formulating their ideas, just again, I think I hear that a lot, and there is a particular piece of research where this is all you can trace it back to. There was a very small piece of research done on a mine site in Queensland in Australia that looked at, I think it was 11 female truck drivers and measured their safety record, the wear and tear of tires, that was it, against their male counterparts, and found that those 11 women overall on average had less wear and tear on the tires, and therefore it was great economic benefit to employ women and so on. I believe that somebody did tell me there was another piece of similar research that has just come out that I haven't yet been able to see, based on another mine site, another group of women. But I worry that there's a little bit of we may have a little bit of an urban myth growing there, which clearly benefits, the equity issue. Hey, women are safer. Women don't cost you as much. Let's get more women involved. Great. But I question what are the assumptions that we're making about women when we say that? And also, what are the assumptions we're making about men? Are we saying that men cannot drive differently, that they cannot be more careful with the equipment if they wanted to be, or if they had different, support, different peer pressure? Are we saying that all women are fundamentally soft and careful and caring? When I did mention this in a presentation a while ago, somebody, a senior manager, just did actually stand up and say, "I've just had to sack a woman because she was driving a truck too dangerously." And so I think there's a danger of sort of feeding into stereotypes again there, which, like I say, may benefit the sort of equity issue. And if that does, then great. Why not use it? But it also lets men off the hook a bit. It sort of says, oh, well, we'll just get those women in. And if we get those women in, they'll be on the trucks and it'll be all fine. It'll be safer now. And again, the responsibility is on the part of women to fulfill that expectation, and often they don't. Courtney has asked, when is the book?
I was hoping to elicit. I think it's, you're right, that men and we're stereotyping and we're saying women are safer drivers and that kind of thing. But I find it interesting that that maybe these kinds of things will have an impact on the gendering of the industry over the course of time, and that those changes that you're talking about can happen. Those positive things can happen to better the industry on both the technical and safety aspects, as well as the health of the people who are within the sector.
Yeah, and I think I see that the argument for that they will eventually have an impact on the wider culture and so on. I think we can also encourage that by, particularly if we have gender diversity rather than a particular kind of man versus a particular kind of woman, we look at diversity as more multiple, the different kinds of men that might be encouraged to join the industry. And I know that sounds weird because you think, well, we've already got enough men. We don't need more men. But what about different kinds of men? Men that have different experiences, different backgrounds, different approaches to the whole to business and to work and so on. Meratu has asked, should the consciousness of gender diversity be seen in the same light? I'm just reading this. In the same light as gender equality in terms of knowledge dissemination and implementation processes related to policy. I'm not sure, hopefully I'm reading this correctly, but I think gender, my sort of work around gender diversity is to make it more visible at the workforce level. So I don't think it's about disseminating knowledge and saying, let's have gender diversity at a policy level, because I worry that it still gets left within HR. But at the workforce level, I'm very interested in finding or helping the everyday worker have the tools and space and resources to be able to negotiate their own gender, which will be shifting and multiple and changing and complex, that I can't possibly hope to understand through a policy. And they're going to be the ones that are living it every day. So I think it's more important to get it to work at that level. Trent has asked, when looking at Aboriginal peoples, the traditional role of mother-daughter, what research around the internal self and external community dissidence that occurs? What tactics have proven to be successful to attract Aboriginal women to mining? And Trent, this is a really important point. I made it quite clear at the beginning of my presentation that there are links between often we assume gender to be homogenous across all cultures and all races and ethnicities and religions and so on. That's just not the case. It constantly comes, and I'm aware that in my book that there is a missing chapter around issues related to gender and Aboriginality. It is not an area that I'm an expert in. I have spoken to a few people who have given some ideas. So I certainly can't. I'm guilty of omitting that. I can't really speak to it. I do know of one particular program. I think it just actually won an internal award at BHP Billiton for one of its sites, where their tactic of attracting Aboriginal women and men was very much based around not seeking to bring the local community people into the mine site so much as seeking to look at the ways that the production practices could change to suit the community. And I think that's along the same lines that I'm talking around. We don't try and fit women into an existing mine production practice. We look at the ways that we can change the production practice to allow diversity to flourish. I've got one more question. What do you think this is from Mera too as well, what do you think of the potential gender bias in job descriptions? I don't know whether it's just in the job descriptions as well. I think I was just, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to have a look at a job description. It wasn't for a gendered position. Particularly, and I wasn't asked to look at it from a gendered perspective, but one of the things that I did notice is that it was, even though the job was requiring a certain set of skills that were quite innovative and new, you would consider innovative and new in this oil and gas company, which is an emerging oil and gas company, they were speaking to an imagined audience already, and it was the audience that they'd always employed. So whether there's any evidence of that, if we've always employed traditionally men, have we really explored the way that we're describing jobs and the kind of skills that we're asking for and the kinds of ways that we talk about our company and talk about that particular position from a gendered perspective? It's okay to say, we don't discriminate in terms of gender for this position, or we encourage women to apply, but is the language actually saying that? And then also, this is one of the barriers that we often find, particularly with the larger companies, recruitment companies that are used to employ and to screen it, to do that initial screening. What is the communication with these recruitment companies so that they're aware of how their own screening processes might actually be, or even sort of, their advertising processes might also be gendered and might not be getting through to a diversity of people, might actually be speaking to the very same kind of person that the industry has always had. Okay, that seems to be the last question. Is everybody still there? I'm hoping so. Okay, Mel. Obviously, if anybody's got any questions, you can email me, and you can also talk to Melanie. Melanie, is there anything that you'd like to say in closing?
I just want to thank you for coming and doing this today with us, Dean, and of course for everybody for joining the webinar and being part of this discussion. Some really interesting food for thought and things to take back to your companies. If you have any questions about the work that MIR does, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. And there's my information there up on the screen. And, we have a lot of resources and things that can help with helping to diversify the workforce. And, of course, I have a line-in with Dean now. We're so pleased to be connected with Factive, so we can connect you with him if you'd like. So thank you very much, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to speak soon.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.